Hi, my name's Jason, and I'm going to talk in this video about building this lap steel guitar. I try to do a cool design which works with the limitations of my carpentry skills, which are pretty good, but I am not as good as some other people. If you want to see a musician make an instrument for the sake of playing it, and it's completely original, and I'm going to talk about some of the design features from an aesthetic and a playability point of view, let's jump in. So I started just by gluing together these pieces of cherry. I planed them down to the same thickness, glued them up, and just started laying out the parts that I had and seeing what looked good. And I was drawing on some of these traditional shapes, and then I decided, wait, you don't need to do a traditional shape. And I had the idea to do this Art Deco guitar, which I'm not going to talk about much more, but you're going to see this shape over and over again. It's an Art Deco design. And I was inspired by the Art Deco in part because I'd seen these tuning keys, but also just the irregular shape of the cherry, the way it glued together, I think was suggesting the Art Deco. This is a part where I'm departing from traditional lap steel design. I'm putting on a regular telly bridge, and this is because it's something I'm used to and I know I can upgrade it and do things with it that I've done with other guitars. I'm not saying that traditional lap steel bridges are bad, I'm just going with what I'm used to. I'm cutting this because I don't want to be locked into the telly bridge position. I want to put it in a middle strat position. And this is fun to watch with all the sparks. It does not hurt, but I am wearing ear, eye, and face protection while I'm doing this. It was an aluminum oxide blade that I used to cut that. I'm going to put links below for some of the tools and bits that I've used in this build, so check that out if you're interested. Now, even though I'm sound first, I do like aesthetics when I can execute within the constraints of my carpentry skills. So to enhance the detail of the Art Deco shape, I decided I would router off about 1.5 millimeters on these square rectangular side panels, and it just really makes that Art Deco shape pop. I'm just clamping my square to the body and using it as a guide to run my router on the line that I want to cut. And then I'm just using a chisel to clean up the corners that the router obviously doesn't get into. After I committed to the Art Deco shape, I ordered these parts, the tuners that I'd mentioned. I'm going to have a fretboard here that's a contrasting color to the cherry wood, and some purfling I'm going to use to make the fretboard markers. So I chose a 22-inch scale, which I'll explain in a minute. I'm using a nice sharp pencil to lay it out. Longer strings have better harmonics, but the shorter strings make it easier to do slants with the bar. So if you have a major interval between any two strings and then you slant it backwards, you will take the higher string down a half step. Ergonomically speaking, the less you have to slant there, the kind of easier it is. So I went with the 22-inch scale, which is sort of on the shorter side of normal for a lap steel, because I wanted that kind of expression capability in the instrument. So I knew this would work out because I had measured the width of that particular saw blade with some calipers, and then I ordered the purfling that was the matching width that would fit into those slots. To get the measurements for the 22-inch scale, StewMac has a calculator. I'm sure there are others. I've been playing this for a while now, and the contrasting purfling color to the fretboard, it's very easy to see. This has worked out really well. So with this headstock, I'm echoing the Art Deco design ideas again, and I'm measuring this out really carefully because I want the strings to have a straight pull over the nut and line up into the tuning keys perfectly, and everything is going to look nice and straight together. So to achieve that, I need to measure everything out to the nearest millimeter before I start cutting. Because of the grain direction, when you're cutting out any kind of cavity like this, the wood is going to want to split. So if you leave not enough wood, I figured it was going to be awfully fragile. So I left the back on this headstock, and that's about 7-8 millimeters thick of wood, which is plenty of beefy enough that this is strong. Now the flip side of that is it's not the easiest to get in there and sand in those corners and clean it up. So I did it the best I could with chisels and routers, and it looks pretty good. You can't tell from here, which is fine by me. So this is one of those times where it's an imperfection as a woodworker, but I just don't care as a musician, and it still looks good. So I had drilled it out with a Forstner bit. Now I'm just cleaning it up with a router on a bearing and the chisel as much as I can. Now I'm test fitting to make sure that this is going to work out the way that I want, because actually I do have the option to cut the entire thing off and build a fresh one and just glue it on. But I did a good job measuring. It all worked. And this is another aesthetic detail where I realized you don't need the full width of the fretboard on a lap steel, so I thought I could echo in the Art Deco design again. So when I was designing these fretboard cuts, I used a principle called the golden ratio. We tend to find it pleasing to see things which are about 1.7 times difference in size. So the golden ratio is just like an interesting tool that you can use when you want to design something where they don't have even matching sizes. Back to carpentry, I cut as much as I could on the power saws, cleaned it up with the hand saws, and then I lined it up carefully to where the nut and the center line was and glued it on. In another departure from traditional lap steel design, I'm going to use a bone nut. And again, this is because it's something I'm used to. I know what a bone nut's going to sound like, so that's what I did. But to get the string height that you needed for the lap steel, I basically had to do a bridge style design. So now I'm building something that is kind of like an acoustic guitar bridge to put on the nut of this guitar. And I want the strings to be all straight and parallel, so I'm using my bridge plate to measure out exactly where the strings are going to end up, and this is the thing I need to carve out with my little mini router. And this was a thing that I didn't necessarily do a great job on. I didn't get this slot to perfectly match the width of that piece of bone, so I had to shim it later, but still overall, I'm not at all disappointed with the design or execution. It's worked out really well. So the pickup ring is something that I guess I'm quite proud of from a design point of view. I thought that the purple and the round really made a nice contrast with the rest of this natural finish instrument. The purple in particular, I literally just saw it on Amazon when I was cruising around for parts. But the other thing I want to talk about is the string height. With a lap steel, you want to have some room to be able to operate with finger picks. The general rule that I got was about 10 millimeters, which is the distance that I set the strings above the fretboard. Because my fretboard is raised, I've actually got about 14 millimeters here. So really I was just doing the math to figure out how thick does this pickup ring need to be to put the pickup where I need it to be. So a lot of the building of this thing was aesthetic, so I'm just kind of sketching in, figuring out what's going to look good. I figure out the thickness I need, and I'm starting to draw it onto this little piece of scrap cherry and cut it all out as needed. And I'm just cleaning it up by hand, and it worked pretty well. And again, with the middle, I'm just tracing around. I found the closest drill bit I had, drilled out, and just carved and did whatever it took. And here's the purple pick guard that I bought. I just glued it on and use a router and some sandpaper to cut it flush to the piece of wood underneath. And once I'd built this nice pickup ring, I knew I would want my control routing at the back to feature the nice pickup ring on the front. So I'm just figuring out where my pots are going to come out, and then I'm going to flip over to the back to do the routing. Now on the back, I tried to do an oval to match, but I found it difficult to cut the aluminum plate that I'm going to put on later to match that oval. So I ended up routing it out to a square. I had to buy this extra long drill bit to do that just one thing. And we're repeating the same basically for the jack plate. So here's a possible design error, that there's not a lot of wood thickness here to fit this jack plate. As a result, when I was routering this out to get the jack in, it was very thin and fragile, and it actually did crack while I was working it. Now I'm really not concerned about it now because it's got a piece of aluminum supporting it, but just from a design point of view, I probably should have avoided going in this direction through a piece of wood this thickness. So design aside, we're cutting some aluminum, and I found this quite easy to work with. However, when I was cutting it with the power tools, it was spitting off little shards of aluminum. Not that they were sharp particularly or hot, but little tiny things flying fast. You definitely want to make sure you've got all the right protective equipment that you don't catch that in the eye. And I just got to point out, really pretty drill shavings. And I'm countersinking everything so the screws will be flush. The other thing to know with the aluminum is that it didn't polish really bright and shiny the way I thought it might. It didn't disappoint me really, but just so you know. So sanding is really boring, and I probably don't do as much as some woodworkers say you should. And so this is my guitar making brand I call Make It Fit, which is the philosophy that I was talking about earlier. What's really beautiful to me is something that is functional and inspiring. I don't need things to be perfect. And in fact, I kind of like it when they're jammed together. It's just my personality. I like guerrilla style, I guess. So I invented Make It Fit to sort of describe that, and I put that name on all of the instruments that I've been making. So this is how I did the logo. I just printed that off and super glued it to the guitar and then used the pin router and manually carved it out. I wasn't really worried about it perfectly matching the paper. The paper was just a guide so that everything was sort of appropriately sized. I'm filling this with acrylic paint, which I actually had to do twice because the paint shrunk, I guess, as it dried. Anyway, it worked out well. The water here just kind of shows what it's going to look like after it's varnished. And then after I had the logo on, I had to do a whole bunch more sanding before I could get to the process of putting a poly finish on it. I'm using some old bicycle parts that I had lying around to make a hanger because I don't have a spray booth. I use a wipe-on polyurethane because you don't need a sprayer. You just need a glove and a rag and you just do the work. Now there's a saying, it's fast, cheap, and good. You can have two. So I'm not getting fast when I use this wipe-on polyurethane, but by doing it step by step over a few days, you can get a really nice finish. I think one of the reasons you wouldn't see this on a commercial guitar is not because it's a bad finish, it just takes too long. Now, unfortunately, I was really silly and I forgot to put the dots on before I finished it, so I had to go back and do that. I'm actually using side dot material, so it's plastic, and I just drilled the holes and I glue them in. Now, I was hoping if I sharpened up my chisel really well, I'd be able to just shave it off, but that did not work, and I ended up having to sand it all down, including the finish off, and then refinish the fretboard. Starting with the electronics, I got this foil, which was not very expensive, so I figured if it helps a little bit, it's worth it. If it doesn't really help, it was cheap anyway. I am definitely not a soldering master. I know what it's supposed to look like if you heat up the part as opposed to melting the solder directly, then the part itself is hot enough to attract the solder on, like that. So having it all soldered up, it was time to test it. So I plugged it in. I didn't have strings on it yet, so I'm just tapping away and I can see the signals coming through. So in the final assembly stages, nothing is particularly difficult. It's just a bunch of work. I had to drill some holes in my pretty pickup ring to install it, but that is a functional requirement. I'm really glad I bought that countersink bit because it's been very useful on this project. And I'd mentioned this before, but the nut didn't fit really tightly into that slot, so I had to put on this shim of a Queen of Hearts, which I actually thought looked really cool, but then when I lowered the string height down, you could barely see the Queen of Hearts. So it's in there, I know it's there, but it's not as cool as it was. So I do own a set of nut files, which I think is actually a pretty cool thing for a guitar player to have, to be able to do your own fine adjustments to setups to get your guitars working the way you want. Anyway, this thing is ready to do a test play.